I learned about this guy here, Dan Wootton, from following Johnny and Amber, and you probably know Dan wrote some bad things about Johnny in The Sun, false allegations, but now it seems that Dan's got false allegations against him. It also seems Dan got axed from two of his biggest jobs, I think his only jobs, Mail Online and GB News. Here's from the Byline Times. It's an excerpt from an article I covered, which was very long, so I figured I'd break down a little bit more of it. It's called Useful Until They Aren't. Now, what nobody's talking about, except Byline Times here, who seems to have some inside knowledge, is how Dan feels and how Dan's acting. We can only imagine, really. I mean, on the surface, Dan's pumping out X posts. He was on GB News for a little while until the recent little debacle he had, but now it seems like that's at an end. So here, which is from October 1st, they say Dan had a little breakdown in the back room. Wootton has presented a defiant front throughout the developing scandal. Until this week, he was appearing routinely on his show, offering views on woke politics and matters including allegations of the R word and sexual misconduct leveled at the comedian Russell Brand. Right, I didn't cover Russell because, well, I don't know, seemed to be some risky waters there and everything, but I'll say this now. We need evidence, and it seems like there isn't there either. Now, I'm not sure why they have woke in quotations, but that's a different video for a different day. Away from the cameras, though, it's been a different story. Wootton broke down in the GB News green room during the first advert break of the 17th of July of Dan Wootton Tonight as Byline Times started publishing the result of its special investigation into his activities. Sources described the atmosphere among his 16-strong production team as a funeral. All right, stop right there. So apparently, if it's going to be the atmosphere of a funeral, it seems pretty bad, man. I could only imagine Dan was walking around all pissed. He might have thrown something. He might have broken a chair or whatever. You know, when someone's face is out there and they seem unaffected, it's easy to kind of not think so much about what's going on in the background. But I could buy this. I wouldn't be surprised if Dan threw a vodka bottle at somebody. They say Dan composed himself only to return to the airwaves that next day. And when he did, he launched an attack on Byline Times, its journalists, and his accuser, Mr. Truby. So I gotta imagine if Dan had this breakdown, that would make sense. There were less answers and more questions. He goes nuts, ripping things apart, and they're just watching, probably, little nervous or whatever, and he's probably not fully explaining himself to them, or they would have come out with more knowledge and less questions. They say the July 12th post on X got more than 15 million views. They don't say X, but it was on X. All right, I knew that. In the 6-minute piece, Wootton insisted nefarious players and dark forces were trying to bring the station down and undermine free speech, wrongly branding Byline Times as a far-left blog. Following this, our journalists came under extraordinary attacks. Now, I gotta say, seeing more of what the editor-in-chief puts out there, they do seem left-leaning to me. But that's irrelevant, man. There's really nothing that shows this is political. There's really nothing attacking Dan's actual politics. So even if I was tempted to believe him a little bit, that doesn't erase what they're putting out there in the detail they're putting out there. So it doesn't even matter if it is left-wing or not. All that matters is the content they're putting out there and how credible it is. One had what appeared to be blood smeared on the car window outside their home. Hackers tried to gain access to journalistic material on Wootton held by another. Anonymous callers threatened Byline Times, new executives, as anonymous emails promised that blood will flow. I covered that too, not so long ago. Sounds a little suspicious. They then go on to say that in a meeting with the chief executive at GB News, Dan admitted that this was his alias, Martin Branning. But of course, that hasn't come out anyplace except here for Byline Times. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I'm not saying it needs to be confirmed from a bunch of sources. I'm just saying that they have the inside source and no one else has actually reported on that yet. Maybe they're scared to. The chief exec said, although Dan somewhat admitted it, he wanted Dan on air because of his content that was against cancel culture. Which, by the way, I happen to agree with, but again, it's not relevant to anything about the allegations. They then go on to say that this played poorly with GB News' financial backers. Which makes sense. I mean, to be fair, and take Dan out of the picture for a second, it's the investors and backers who are scared the allegations will hurt the profit and things like that, when most of the time it's the opposite. Most of the time, when someone is accused with zero evidence, not in this case, but I'm saying not about Dan, but as far as the profit, most of the time, it ends up causing more traction and more revenue. So I don't quite get the whole overall picture of what the backers are thinking, but it's their money, and I guess they get scared. Having said that, in this case, it seems like there is some evidence. Passwords, email trails, things like that. This is not a no evidence allegation case. They go on to say there's an agenda from the investors. They are anti-Europe, anti-immigrant, and pro-Boris Johnson on everything, who I know nothing about really. Either way, I'm laser focused on this guy here, Truby, and the allegations about the videos and things like that. The politics, gonna mention it, but not dive into it. And of course, the main takeaway here was Dan having this breakdown in the back room or the green room, whatever it was, that I would personally believe happened. And probably more than once. He must be pretty frustrated. You don't go from, about $1 million a year between two jobs to not having those jobs and not having $1 million a year. That must be frustrating. But oh well, Dan. I mean, look what Dan did. He wrote some silly, fictitious things about Johnny and the Sun. And I guess we're full circle here. Let's see what happens next. If you're not subscribed here, consider it. If you don't, I'll be sad, but I'll get over it. Real quick, shout out to Naomi. She left me a super chat on my last live. Thank you. I had more shout outs, but unfortunately I deleted some screenshots. Really sorry. I have a good idea who it is, but I gotta get it together. Alright, we're done here for now. If you don't subscribe, I'll be sad, but I'll get over it. See you next time.